So welcome everybody, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to acknowledge the countries that we're all meeting and working on today, and pay our respects to elders past and present. I'm Philippa Morn from Regional Arts WA. I'm a program manager with Regional Arts WA. I think you probably all know Regional Arts WA, so I won't give you the spiel on that, but we are recording the video and putting it on the website, which is the reason why I probably should have said who Regional Arts WA is. So yes, look, if you are happy to share your video, it would be lovely to see you all, because we are, really trying to keep this as a chat. People have said to us, there's been a lot of information on websites, and reading through those websites is quite intense, and so keen to have somebody to chat to, and also to be chatting to people across the state. So yes, if you're happy to have your video on, that would be great. I recognise it does sometimes interfere with your data and your bandwidth, so you might not be able to. Please jump in with questions. So, Patrick and I had a bit of a chat about how to run this session. Please feel free to ask the questions through Patrick's talk. So Patrick's going to give a bit of an introduction, talk about what he's been seeing a bit lately with organisations, and then, really open for questions. But yeah, please feel free to sort of jump in anytime. I don't think we've got anybody on the phone. But if there is anybody on the phone, again, please speak up, or maybe, you can click to get attention or something. So yes, I'd like to introduce Patrick Moriarty, and some people may have met Patrick before. He's kind of he's our go-to person when we've got questions of governance. Patrick established our community as an organisation to respond to organisations' governance advice needs, and he's been leading organisations through governance best practice processes for many years now. So really, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Patrick, and to ask you to talk about, yes, what you've been seeing in this environment, and what's a great way for people to be moving forward.
Right, thanks Philippa. Welcome everyone. I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the traditional owners, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Governance and COVID-19, hey, what a beautiful mix. Throw into that the wonderful announcement just in the middle of it of AusCo funding and disaster. So what, and maybe a little bit of background, why am I talking about governance as it relates to COVID? Probably for two reasons. One, we've seen probably two models. One is where boards have started to panic and really started to delve into what is actually operational matters. So in effect, if we colloquially call that interfering. So we've got one cohort of boards that have become so freaked by the situation that not only are they trying to work with management, but they're actually trying to be management. And I think in that context, it's really important to reinforce and get some clarity about the roles and relationships and responsibilities of each of those components. So whether it's the chair, whether it's another board member, or whether it's the board as a whole, or whether it's management, really coming back to that core element of what is the role of the board, what is the role of the manager, and recognising that it's a team. And probably the element that I'm starting to really see needs a large amount of clarity is who and how does anyone contact the management team? And I'd really probably proffer that at this stage, it should all be coming through the chair. So rather than managers getting hassled by 7, 8, 9 directors all at the same time, having 10 different conversations, that it should really be one distilled conversation through the chair. So that clarity of role and relationship there becomes really important at this stage, I think. And I'm sure that some of you have probably had that issue of board members maybe contacting you on weekends and expecting that you're actually working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I think given the fact that we're all people, we need to ensure that we all actually have our own lives as well. So that's probably the one area that I'd say is, initially at least, a lot of concern. Then what we've started to see is boards actually start to move into that whole stuff of the sky's falling, it's all too hard, I really don't want anything to do with it. So we've actually got some boards actually moving away from their actual responsibilities and roles and just doing nothing. Also at the other time, we've, in a similar way, seen managers take on that role of the board and maybe try and do everything at once, maybe not necessarily without approval. But if the board's not supporting you, what do I actually do? So again, I think we really need to ensure that we're actually on this page together, and regardless of some board members or if it's the whole board, not pulling their weight, really having conversations and ensuring that your decision-making processes still have some form of backup. So don't just go off and do things. Still, as much as you can, try and send emails if possible to relevant directors, even if they're not there. And particularly from a manager's perspective, at least then you're covering your own arse. So that's probably what we've been seeing. And really at the time, I think we're really a couple of months into this. And one of the things I think is really it's time for cool head, not panic. And it's easy for me to say. It's a bit like those lovely safety instructions when we get on the plane. I'm sure if we're going down in that bloody plane, no one would be as calm as everything's supposed to be. But as much as it can, it's really a time for cool heads. And probably reflecting on some of the work that we've done with the Australia Council over the last 3-4 years, it probably actually is a really relevant time to be sitting back and reflecting. And we talk about it in terms of 3 questions. If we didn't exist as an organisation, who would miss us? If we didn't exist, what would be lost? And then there's probably a countervailing view to those 2. If we didn't exist, what could be gained? And that final one came out of the session we actually did in Mandurah with Country Arts. And it was a lady sort of coming to the perspective that given there's 600,000 not-for-profits in Australia, maybe some of them have actually gone past their use-by date. And if they did actually get out of the way, it might actually allow other things to actually sprout up that could in effect be different or stronger or more vibrant or more connected. So I think it's a really good time for boards to actually reflect on that. And that sort of leads us into a little bit of reflection initially. And what I'm going to probably be moving into is a little bit of scenario analysis and, in effect, where we are today and where we're going to be probably in the next 3 to 6 months. So a lot of the stuff that we're seeing when there really isn't a clear way forward is organisations and boards starting to chunk down what might have been a 3 or 5 year strategic plan and really focusing on the next 2, 4, 6 months. So digest that down and in effect start to think what the next 2 months might look like, what the next 4 months might look like, and what the next 6 months might look like, because there mightn't be an 8-month or a 12-month. And I think that starts to get us focused a little bit more about some realistic timeframes for us. So where I'd sort of suggest boards should be looking at is what does the past 2-3 months look like, and compare that to where we were last year at this same point in time. So you've got a point of reference. So if this is where we were at last year, here's where we're at now. And that then gives you some hope of saying and being able to articulate to potential funders in the future or potential supporters or potential members, here's the actual impact on us as an organisation compared to last year. And you might, if you like, if you have got the data, be able to reflect on that, over the last 3 years, we've been a growing organisation, our membership's been thriving, or whatever it might be. Because it then gives you a trend and a little bit of context for you to be able to argue your case sometime in the future. And then what some of you will probably be aware of is I'm a bit of a fan of a little tool called the PESTLE. So in effect, it's reflecting on what's changed politically, what's changed economically, what's changed socially, technologically, legally, and environmentally. And if I put that to your board and said, okay, what has that change been like over the last 3 months? And then looking forward, what's our best guess on each of those elements? So it gets us thinking about what could happen rather than what will happen. And that then starts to get us to think about, well, if these sort of things are going to happen, how should we be planning for it? And probably looking at, does it actually have to be us that does all of the work? So is it actually something that we could look at in terms of an opportunity rather than a threat? So is there an opportunity for, potential acquisition? Is there potential partners or collaborators that we could work with? Or in worst case, what's our exit strategy going to be? So what do we expect to occur and how we're going to react? So that's sort of the fleshing of what that might look like in practice. Well, the first step would be, from that PESTLE, what are our key risks? And that can be done in a number of ways. It could be clunking it down again, in risks according to time or cost or resources, or it could just be us saying, well, okay, what are the physical risks, technical risks, or environmental risks? Taking an example of time, it could be schedule overruns, it could be an extension of the closed borders, or it could be a regional staged unlocking. And then what does that mean for us in terms of those risks? How can we actually think of what the impact of that is going to be on us? And, using your standard risk matrix of high risk, low risk, and low impact, high impact. Start to look at what those scenarios might be and where they might be on that risk matrix. And then the third step would be to sort of create some contingency plans around each of those scenarios. So if those were to occur, what is our strategy to react to that? Because what we tend to find is people are planned or locked into a certain way of thinking. And when shit does happen, they don't have anything to reach into their bottom drawer to pull out to enable them to act relatively quickly. And I think this has been a really good example of how shit can happen. And not that we would ever probably have predicted a pandemic, although a lot of organisations have had pandemic policies. But it's about us sort of saying, well, if a major incident occurs, how are we going to react to that? What are our likely steps and roll out in that? So that's sort of where I'm thinking that a lot of boards should be, but I'll probably gather they're not. So that'd be an interesting question to hear from anybody. Where are you at with those sort of plans, or where are you at in terms of your structures? My perspective, I really think that quote about never let a good crisis go to waste is a really good way for us to start to think about this isn't all negative, and it may actually lead to some really positive change, not necessarily for every organisation, but for some. But if we're not thinking about it as a way of grabbing opportunity, then I think we're missing out. Maybe over to you guys. Are there any thoughts, any questions, any concerns that you've got?
So, Patrick, I might jump in with a question from Kate from Arts Narrogin. Given the current uncertainty, how would you approach crucial funding applications that require you to submit budgets and plans for the next 3 years?
Again, probably using that scenario analysis, and I would hope at this point in time funders are a little bit more receptive to flexibility in that stuff. So there's nothing stopping you providing different scenario-based budgets to them for the next 3 years. You know, you could say that, and maybe taking that example of before, you know, if we would have been on our standard path, our budgets and plans would have been this. However, given the context, our best guess at where we are likely to be is this. So there's nothing, and I think that would give funders the knowledge that you're not living in a dream world, and it would provide them ample evidence that you're actually thinking about what that impact is, what it has been, and how you're going to adapt and modify your plans to it. So I think it would be a good way of trying to approach that.
Is that also then where, like, being able to demonstrate a strong governance process and strong governance documents and thinking potentially could help as well?
Yeah, Philippa, I think in all of these contexts, where you've got support and the evidence to support it, you know, your strategic plan isn't necessarily a document that should live and breathe for 3 or 5 years anyway. You've got, or you should, have some very broad areas of results or strategic drivers or strategic intents. Now, they mightn't change over the next 3 years, but your objectives or your strategies to get there are likely to change. So your broad key result areas might still be performance, cultural vibrancy, membership, whatever they might be, but your elements or objectives beneath them may have been modified, and you might have reduced some of those objectives. I think we've had the discussion previously that what we tend to find with a lot of organisations is, in effect, a bit of a disconnect between the board and management, and the board expecting a hell of a lot can be achieved in 5 years, and the managers, in effect, almost accepting that they're going to be working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the thing I think that this provides us is an opportunity for the board and management to get on the same page, to have those discussions. Because from a lot of the work that I've done with arts organisations, it's not a plan, it's almost a dream. And your plan, you know, you can push the edges with it, but it shouldn't kill people to achieve the outcomes. And I think that's the issue that we were probably discussing 6-8 months ago with OSCO, that a lot of organisations and a lot of management and part-time employees, in effect, were being asked to, in effect, deliver something that could never be delivered. So, you know, make sure your plans are actually achieved. That SMART principle is as relevant today as it ever has been.
Does anyone else have any questions, you know, particularly pertaining to what Patrick's been talking about so far? Peter, I see you've written quite a few comments in the chat. I'm not really clear if there's a governance question in there that Patrick can answer. Do you want to perhaps unmute yourself and see if there is a question in there that Patrick can help you with?
Hi, it's Pania. Pete's the boss. He's just had to run out and take an appointment. Oh, I'm just going to see what. If you give me a second to read through, and then I can come back to you on that.
Okay.
So maybe Pani, and Philippa, if I maybe pick up the first bit.
Yeah.
Great.
So everyone's aware. Pete said that because we've lost 2/3 of our population, we will need the following items to have a real change. So rather than me talking about the specifics of what needs to change, if I maybe talk about that we've lost 2/3 of our population. Now, I could equally say to some organisations, they've probably lost 2/3 of their support. So regardless of whether it's population or whether it's funding or whether it's support or membership, that's what I'm talking about in terms of that scenario analysis. Is that 2/3 likely to be maintained for 6 months, 12 months, or are we unlikely to see those 2/3 of the population ever return? I think that's the question, the strategic intent the boards need to have, the discussions around. And I'd like there to be some form of support. You know, ideally, your local government's probably doing similar sort of scenario analysis around those elements. So, and again, maybe teeing that back up with those funding applications. If you've got a reasonably robust, reputable, shall we say, source that you can actually rely on in terms of that evidence base, I'll be using that wherever I can. And maybe taking Pete's case of losing 2/3 of the population, that's a pretty strong case to call for support. I always, when we're talking about the grant submission stuff, Philippa, that I always say to the people in the room, who would you support? An organisation that's increasing in the most rapidly populated area in Australia, or a really small rural population where it's rapidly declining? Virtually everyone grabs for the rapidly developing high population growth area, and really it then gets back to that fundamental question of, it doesn't really matter what the case is, it's why you need it that you've got to argue. So that coming back to the why you exist and why you support and why the arts are important to Australian society, in your context, that's the critical thing that's going to get you over the line with that funding, because it's your proof of case.
I guess when we speak, so we're Patrick, we are the local government authority, and I guess, and it'll be true of all organisations, smaller resource communities, they find themselves in quite competitive spaces when we're going for funding, and that would be the same for smaller organisations and individual artist groups as well. So to be able to, in some areas, take that competitiveness out of funding applications to support those artists and the creative industries would see some stimulation and a diversity of economy in the smaller communities, and of course, as we know, increase the lived experience that our rural towns and our remote communities need.
Pani, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I can remember, Philippa, I forget where you guys had your last get together. It was down south.
Are you talking about the summit in Mandurah?
Yeah, it was Mandurah. Someone was talking about the fact that, in effect, the Arts Centre had become the de facto men's shed / footy club, because the footy club, the men's shed, had basically disappeared. So the last point of contact for that small rural community to get blokes off the farm, to have a conversation and think about anything other than farming, was actually now the Arts Centre. And it made a real impact on me in terms of that. And being able to tell that story in a funding application actually is important. That it may well be that the Arts Centre is the last thing left in town. So evidencing that and supporting it and talking about some of those stories, because as much as we like to think it's all data driven, Some of it's about pulling on the heartstrings and being able to tell those stories.
That sounds a bit like the story that I think Ravensthorpe talk about a bit, that the community art group in Ravensthorpe Regional Arts Council, yes, has become much more a hub than some of the more traditional gathering places in Ravensthorpe. Mm.
And I think it was about the fact that the footy club had actually folded because, you know, partly in that context, they just didn't have the youth coming through to support the club. You know, I could probably talk about it in a local football, country football context in Victoria. You know, it's something we're seeing the same things of, but we've also seen some magnificent success stories of mergers of clubs, and how it's actually brought communities together rather than pulled them apart. So, you know, sometimes, and that's what I was talking about in that scenario analysis, it doesn't have to be death and gloom for everything, but it's about being able to tell that story and provide the data to support it. You know that classic question is, why are the arts important in Australia? Well, you know, 3/4 of the people don't realise they're actually participating with the arts every day. Listening to music, they're watching TV. They're doing it, they just don't think they're doing it. And that's maybe our role as boards, to be more of advocates for the arts. So maybe if I put a question out there, how are your boards supporting you? Positively? Negatively? Thoughts, anyone?
Were you trying to say something, Jane?
Yes, I just was reflecting when you were talking at the beginning, Patrick, that we're incredibly fortunate because our board, and I'm the executive officer for Esperance Community Arts, we've got a fantastic board who are very supportive and been taking a really great role in terms of providing some leadership as well in response to the current circumstances. So that balance, I think, in our case is really good. I've certainly felt very supported by the board. Yeah, so ours is a good story.
So maybe picking up on that, how have you been able to look at that planning of the next 6 months?
We haven't got to that point. I think that's the next board meeting, probably that's going to start to happen. We really just have been dealing with the immediate circumstances and working out how to proceed with programs and keeping within restrictions and those sort of things in the short term. So that long-term planning is something that I think is going to start happening very soon. We've got grant applications due obviously in the next month or so, couple of months. So that process, I'm sure, will begin now.
Patrick, how would you know, like, what would be the kind of the indicators that would say that you could say, yes, our board is supporting us well, or no, the board is not supporting us well? What kind of things would you hope that they're doing, have been doing and are doing at this time?
Probably the first thing I'd say is they're still meeting.
Mm.
So whether that's, you know, in most cases it'll be by this wonderful thing called Zoom or Teams or whatever it might be, but you still need that connection. You still need that sense of belonging, and I think the critical thing, using an example that I've got at the moment, is I've had one organisation have issues with probably over half of their board. So they're basically down to 3 or 4 active board members. And the 3 and 4 who are actually still continuing to meet and make decisions and trying to drive that board forward, starting to crack it a bit with the other 3 or 4. And you sort of said to me, how do I get them off? You know, how do we get them off now because they're not contributing? And I think this is something we need to be all mindful of. People are under a lot of stress at the moment. And to actually react that way and say, well, you know, maybe you should be off if you're not contributing, is that the human thing to do? So I'm almost reluctant to say get them off. I'd say still include them. This is where I was saying before, include them in all of the communications. The fact they're not active, I think we've seen at the very start of this, all the regulators in one way, shape or form say, hey guys, if you're not exactly strictly adhering to your rules, we understand. But I would still have the evidence to support any of the decisions that those 3 or 4 might be making. So that'd be the first thing. I'd also, when we sort of get into crisis, the first thing we look at is the finances. And every decision shouldn't still be made on a financial basis. There may be opportunities for you to consider, you know, if the finances are that critical that we shut up shop, that is, you know, a legal decision you need to make. However, every decision the board makes shouldn't be based on finance. So what other factors are we looking at and coming into consideration of when we're making those decisions? So that would be the other element. Obviously, finance is important, but I think there's an element that not every decision should be made on a financial basis. It obviously has a financial impact, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the key factor.
So that's when you start looking at what is our organisation about, why do we exist, what is our purpose and all that sort of thing.
And probably to pull up a story from the past of organisations in effect struggling in the funding landscape that we are actually in. And I always use the example of probably not this last round, but the round 4 years before when OzCo did cut funding again. Remember those beautiful days? And we suddenly saw a lot of arts organisations suddenly enter the education field and become providers of arts education. Now, I can understand why it happened, but is that actually their core reason for existing? And in effect, if we're talking about it, it's actually about that whole thing of mission drift and organisations suddenly going into an area that they never deemed they'd actually be in. And then all of a sudden they come out of it as a completely different organisation. And the focus then might become the whole thing is the education part, not the reason they was originally established and the reason that their actually purpose is, that it might have been performance. So again, getting back to that core of the purpose of why we exist, not necessarily what we're doing. I can almost feel that short term, I don't have an issue with it, but if that suddenly becomes our purpose for being, is that what we're actually all about? And a lot of that reflection should be coming at this point in time. The board's getting behind that strategy linked to our purpose.
So I'm just communicating with somebody on the chat. If you could all continue to chat with Patrick and I'll be right back with you.
I'm just seeing one there, Gail. Our board panicked a bit, well-meaning, very worried and passionate about us wanting to budget some money over the next few months to be able to support contract artists. I don't have an issue with the board actually getting to the people element, not necessarily the finance element, but everything in balance. I think it would be wonderful to support local artists who largely haven't been able to access JobKeeper, job seeker support. But is that something that's also then going to put your own organisation at complete and utter risk? So again, make sure it's balanced. And I think that's where a lot of us have got into. We've I wouldn't say mad panic, but we've battened down the hatches, do nothing. It sort of almost reminds me of public liability insurance issues 20 years ago, when we virtually lost every festival in Australia because they couldn't get insurance. Well, if you probably took the 5% of true risky activities in that festival, you could probably still do 95% of it and not be worried about insurance. But again, that's risk. So again, going back to those risk elements and the scenarios around them, I'd love to see boards having those discussions, and not necessarily just internal. Get advice from people that are external to the organisation. There's nothing wrong with them seeking advice. And I think to think that every board knows everything about everything is ridiculous. And I'd really encourage boards to look outside of their own organisation, to maybe look at other organisations and maybe have collaborative discussions that are not necessarily tied by distance.
Patrick, you've talked about, you use the phrase never waste a good crisis, and you've also talked about how people are really stressed at the moment. And there are some immediate concerns that people need to be looking at and thinking about, and there are immediate staffing concerns, immediate membership concerns, immediate finance concerns. And those kind of things take up a lot of brain space and a lot of emotional space. If a board is wanting to start to think about, okay, how do we move out of this? Like, how do we start to think long term? How do we look for the opportunities? Have you got any suggestions about potentially how a board might help itself to make that transition and to change that mindset and actually start to, how do you do that when you're in this really sort of stressful, uncomfortable time?
I would divide and conquer.
What does that mean?
My rule of thumb would be, if these are the 6 things that we've got to do, I'm going to allocate one responsibility to each board member. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that board member has to do it all, but it means that that board member starts to drive it. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a board member, it could be a staff member. So in this context, okay, we want to look at membership. So I've got responsibility for membership, so I start to do the deep dive into it, but it doesn't mean I'm alone again. So who are the experts in my local area who are really good at being able to get blood out of a stone and pull people up in terms of their memberships? What are their strategies? How do they do it? Well, why wouldn't I go and have a chat with them about what they're actually doing and how they've been able to manage it? Who's been able to survive? Who's been able to thrive? So doing some of that, and maybe getting them on a working group with you. And maybe there's someone else that you could drag into that who could help you do some of the nuts and bolts, or maybe do some of the analysis, or maybe do some of the financial stuff. It doesn't mean that they have to be on your board, doesn't mean they have to be in your organisation. It's just that people are willing to help if they get asked. So if I'm good at something and I'm asking them to help us out in what is a crisis, it's not them sitting on your board, which they'd probably be running, a million miles from, but it's them saying, yeah, I can help you out with that, but, I'm not going to give you my life. So, cut it down, put it in digestible chunks again, and that way the board can still have those conversations about each of those elements. But it's in effect, you're using better utilisation of people's time and energy. My view of the world is, don't invite me to a meeting if it hasn't got a purpose. So let's make those meetings about that purpose, and be pre-informed. So back to the stuff that if I was doing it, I'd if we were talking about membership, here's a briefing paper on it. So here's the background, here's the recommendation, here's what else we've looked at, here's the costs and benefits of each of those elements, here's who wins, here's who loses, all of that stuff that should be in a good briefing paper. And now, you know what? I could make that decision via email, not necessarily even have to meet face-to-face or even on Zoom. So it's being smarter about some of your activities and how you actually gather that information and knowledge and how you share it. And again, if you get asked, it doesn't mean you have to accept, and it doesn't mean you have to refuse.
And I suppose potentially in that situation when, we're feeling overwhelmed by all the facets that we need to look at, potentially if you're kind of going, okay, I'm focusing on this one thing, that actually allows you to kind of let the rest of the things go, maybe until you come back to the board meeting and things, but you can be actually kind of, it almost gives you a sense of, I've got an area of focus and a certain element of control if you've got your specific space that you're focusing on.
And it doesn't, I go off and take complete and utter control of it and drive it. It means that I facilitate it actually being done.
Mm-hmm.
It still comes back to the board for decision and with management, here's what we're thinking. But it's a piece of the story, it's not the whole story. But I think it's a smarter way of doing it, and again, it doesn't mean we isolate in effect the organisation and the people within it. It gets us thinking externally. It gets us thinking about, who are we looking at this stage who would be really good examples of people that have been successful in that element. Well, okay, let's ask them how they've done it.
And so then that leads into starting to think about, okay, where do we go, when we get through all these, the funding application, all those kinds of things, sort of post-isolation, that kind of process?
Yeah, and,
my question.
If I went down the path of longer term, the thing that I'd be saying, if it was my board, is what is the next normal? What does our next normal look like? Because I'm going to bet it's different to what we were. Is it substantially different or is it the same? So if I said to each of the organisations, what does your next normal look like, or what will your new normal be, or is it exactly the same? I'd be really surprised if it was exactly the same. Because I think, taking today as an example, I've said for years that people should be using this sort of stuff for their bloody board meetings. Why travel an hour and a half to get to a bloody board meeting at 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening and pouring rain? Oh, stuff it. I just won't go. Well, if I could sit at home and do this and the meeting was effective, my God, I've been saying it for years. I don't think it's that. I'm not saying we don't want face-to-face. We still need the connection and people being in front of you. But if we did half our meetings by Zoom, particularly in the bush, how good would that be? I've just saved 10 hours of my life, probably.
I'm interested to hear if anyone's thinking about what the next normal might be like and what sort of things that they, as an organisation, either board, management, even purpose, might take out of this period and take into the next, what the new world might look like. Has anyone been thinking about that, or even, glimmering about what that might look like? Hi, Megan.
Oh.
Sorry, who's speaking?
Jane.
Sorry, Jane.
Megan, did you want to? Just in response to that question, so one of the things that we've started to work on is building our capacity around online content delivery so that we can be more flexible and potentially do both as we can start to run small workshops again, we could also be potentially doing some online delivery, and that's something that's valuable into, you know, beyond this time as well, to have more capacity in that area. Given our location and that in our region there's a number of small surrounding communities that we may be able to connect with more effectively, if we can do that better. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Now I'm trying to unmute you, Megan. Are you?
Yeah, probably very similar. We're just in the very early planning stages of starting to look into doing the same sort of things. Discussing. So just taking it as an opportunity to kind of have a bit of a reset and what else can we offer to the community.
I'm on the board of a theatre company, and one of the things that so similarly looking at online offerings, but one of the things that we kind of twigged to after we'd had a couple of Zoom board meetings, we suddenly went, our constitution doesn't actually allow us to have electronic board meetings, and so which prompted a call from me to Patrick. So that's something that we've kind of suddenly discovered that we're actually going to need to change within our constitution to, and we're going to have to, you know, kind of retrospectively, what do you call it, Patrick, sort of legalise these meetings that have happened and these decisions that have been made. But yes, that's something that we've kind of gone, that we will need to do, but similarly has opened up this world of kind of people in different time zones, which we had kind of half-heartedly done in the past. Like we have artists on the board and sometimes they're touring interstate or things, and so we would kind of go, yes, we can have you on Zoom, and of course it always doesn't quite work. And so now that we can see it really does work, you know, that's something that we'll be doing differently, as well as similarly our offering being, you know, having the option of, I think we're still at heart a place where people come together in the same place at the same time kind of organisation, but also, offering that kind of thing.
Maybe picking something up on that, Philippa. You've got Victoria and New South Wales that are still in relatively severe isolation. If I was an arts organisation in WA, South Australia or the NT or Canberra, how could I actually capitalise on that? You know, other organisations that we could be collaborating with in Victoria or New South Wales who probably can't make a cracker at the moment, and could that, and I understand the 14 days isolation, but imagine if we got someone of a very strong reputation to be able to, let's say, tour WA. And we pulled them out of very cold, miserable, bleak Melbourne and had them touring over WA at this time when they cannot do that in their own environment. It's looking at it in a different lens and being creative about taking the opportunities that other people maybe have some misfortune with.
Does anyone have any other questions or comments or things they'd like to share? Patrick, is there anything else that you particularly want to say, you know, if you only remember one thing?
If I had to remember one thing, it would be I don't have to meet bloody face to face. I think if there's one thing this has really taught us, it is the fact that I can actually go to a meeting without actually being there. And, you know, I've had international tourism associations doing this for years. I think in the context that we're now in, I think it's a proof of concept that this thing can actually work.
Just
and
update
I think it's even more important in rural locations. Yeah, that tends to help. There's a lot of things we could talk about. The constitutions, let's maybe keep that for a certain day, and probably one that I just did probably 2 months ago, and it might have been just at the start of this. A circular resolutions policy may be a worthwhile thing for you to look at also, folks.
So I have been talking with Patrick about the possibility of us kind of doing a bit more of a formal kind of step-by-step process through both this period and governance, and really kind of like strengthening, you know, making sure that governance is really secure so that organisations can respond flexibly to these kind of situations. So I'd be really interested in hearing any feedback from you on, you know, what sort of things you might like, whether that's something that would be helpful, if that's something that we should be pursuing. You know, we're putting a lot more focus into capacity development, and we're always hearing that people want to have more emphasis on governance. So yeah, I'd be really interested to hear any more feedback on governance, on what sort of things you would like programs developed in, and potentially either we'll be developing them or we will source them. You know, there are a number of providers doing a number of topics, so we can do that. If you've had a look at the development calendar, where all we've done is put into one calendar all the webinars that we've discovered, and you can see there are heaps of people providing heaps of opportunities to learn about lots of different topics. So we can either look at developing a program or sourcing somebody who's already doing it. So we'd love to hear any feedback either now or in future. Like, please get in contact. And also, if there's any particular topics that you'd like us to be doing through the regional chats, or if there's something that you would like to talk about, if you want to start saying, this is the topic that I want to lead a discussion on, be really interested in hearing about that as well. Any thoughts on that at this point? Nari, is that you want to say something, or is that just generally supportive of the whole concept? Unmuting Nari.
Not necessarily. I'm enjoying hearing people's point of view and the information shared. I'm not currently on the board at the moment. I'm an independent artist working with Denmark Arts.
Okay.
So it's, yeah, good to just hear your perspectives and experience with being on boards, and dealing as an independent artist. I suppose that's where I'm coming from, how to work with that board and that organisation effectively with planned projects.
Yes, I think the other really big thing I think that is really evident in this time is communication, and clear communication, and regular without being excessive, and that's a tricky balance to strike. Yes, going back to the organisation that I'm with, outside of Regional Arts WA, the artists asking for really clear guidance about what, you know, how both the board and the operations is going to happen has been a really important thing, I think, in maintaining their confidence and their sense of security as well.
Yeah, and gives you a chance to align with what their goals are a bit more.
Yeah, great point, great point.
Adjust your projects to fit in with what they're doing.
Yeah. Cool. Anybody else got any comments, response to that, or anything else that they want to say?
Yeah, look, could I just say as a board chair and also, you know, very much in touch with the activities of the organisation on an ongoing basis, real frustration around the current situation where we've had grants applications up that we had every reason to believe were going to be successful, and being cancelled by funders at the last minute because of the current situation, sort of whipping the rug out off from under our feet there, and then having a lot of the funding sources that we would normally be dealing with narrowing their focus very much, and understandably in the circumstances, to be focused very much on the immediate relief situation, and suddenly the sorts of things we will be doing for the future are just disappearing. We've also got the issue where projects that we have currently underway we're no longer able to fully complete because it's simply not possible to do it in the restricted environment we're working in at the moment, and we're looking down the barrel of potentially losing some of that funding as well. So that adds up to a really difficult environment to do any sort of sensible planning of the way forward. Yeah, I mean, it's looking for the opportunities that might be there, but it's certainly extremely challenging.
Maybe to, I don't want to end this in such a gloomy perspective, but given the deficits that we're probably going to have at every state and federal level for the next God knows how long, one thing I'd be scenario planning around is that one part of the new normal is we're going to have to be operating on less funding for at least the next couple of years. I don't necessarily want to end that on such a gloomy note, but the reality, like if we're talking about $50 billion deficits and things like this, and as some of you will no doubt concur, we don't seem to get the same funding as sport. But, you know, I think combined, that pool of grant funding is probably going to be reduced for the next couple of years. I think that's sadly part of the new reality.
Yes, and it's also, I suppose, it's not going to be kind of like, you know, things went bad and then things will get better again. It'll be kind of, I mean, hopefully there will be a positive trend line, but it will probably be bumpy along the way. And I think potentially this is where the conversation needs to be, where the art sector as a whole really needs to have that, you know, to be having that conversation and trying to have that plan, you know, to support the funding bodies and advocate to the funding bodies and support them to advocate to the government about a plan around that. I think there's quite a lot of food for thought in that discussion. Sorry, Patrick.
And I think that's where it becomes more important for us to gather those human stories to be able to communicate to the politicians that this is part of why we need the arts in Australia, not just in metropolitan Melbourne, but throughout the whole width and breadth of this beautiful brown country.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you for your questions and thank you for chatting. This has been the most chatting of our chats, so that's great. And as I said, yes, please let us know if there's any particular topics that you're wanting to hear about, or as I said, if you'd like to lead a conversation. And I think I'll let everybody go and say thank you and see you next time. Thank you all for coming.
See you, folks. Thanks for having me.